Ah, yes, I knew it was this chapter.
Of course you did, Shane.
So we'll actually be here for the next 2 weeks, because there are kind of two aspects of John 15 to look at, and that I was kind of giving the talk over. For the first part,
Yeah, why?
does somebody want to go ahead and start reading from
Verse 1.
verse 1 through verse 8?
Okay, I guess I'll start. I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that bears fruit, he trims so that it may bear more fruit. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Abide in me, I will abide in you. The branch cannot itself produce fruit unless it abides on the vine. Likewise, you cannot produce fruit unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. The one who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit. But apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and is dried up. Such branches are picked up and thrown into the fire and burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish and it shall be done for you. This is my Father. In this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples.
And then does somebody else want to go ahead and read verses 9 through 17?
I can.
Okay.
I have loved you even as the Father has loved me. Remain in my love. When you obey my commandments, you remain in my love, just as I obey my Father's commandments and remain in his love. I have told you all these things so that you will be filled with my joy. Yes, your joy will overflow. This is my commandment. Love each other in the same way I have loved you. There is no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you slaves, because a master doesn't confide in his slaves. Now you are my friends, since I have told you everything the Father told me. You didn't choose me, I chose you. I appointed you to go and produce lasting fruit, so that the Father will give you whatever you ask for, using my name. This is my command. Love each other.
If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. Remember the words I spoke to you. No servant is greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. If they obeyed my teaching, they will obey yours also. They will treat you this way because of my name, for they do not know the one who sent me. If I had not come and spoken to them, they would not be guilty of sin. Now, however, they have no excuse for their sin. He who hates me hates my Father as well. If I had not done among them what no one else did, they would not be guilty of sin. But now they have seen these miracles, and yet they have hated both me and my Father. But this is to fulfill what is written in their law. They hated me without reason. When the Counselor comes, whom I will send to you from the Father, the Spirit of truth, who goes out from the Father, he will testify about me. And you also must testify, for you have been with me from the beginning.
Amen.
So, there are two kind of components to this one that we'll go over. Next week we'll start talking about love, because that, in the series about relationship, that ends up being one of the most central parts. If trust was central to it, love is also just as central to any form of relationship. But tonight, another component that we're looking at regarding this verse is more about dependency. And the first thing to kind of talk about with that is codependency, and our kind of penchant for that in life and on our own. And see, there's a big difference between being dependent on God and being dependent on other people to find your happiness or your person. See, the reality of it is that with God, nothing changes with him. You are who you are. He was born with a plan for you. He was born with an identity for you. You were created to be a specific person. And that's not just a genetic thing, but even in the way that you were designed to think, to reason, to push forward, there's that part of you that needs God also. And see, it's in that whole thing, when the two of you together, that's the ideal. However, because of that whole, we oftentimes try to fulfill that with relationships around us or other things, objects sometimes. Sometimes we try to fill it with, materials, Pineapple Works. But I'm more thinking about, like, buying things, or alcohol, drugs, sex, any number of different things that we try to fill ourselves with to make that whole kind of disappear. Because, see, the truth of it is that without something else, we're never really whole. Mm-hmm. And that's something that we always struggle with. And see, in discussion about relationship, and especially about dependence on God, we can't have a discussion about this without addressing the reality of codependency. And how often that hole that we carry, that part of our soul that isn't quite complete, will oftentimes, we will be led into places with other people where we're looking for them to complete us, where we're looking for them to fulfill us, to be the that missing piece of the jigsaw that composes our person. And see, the great flaw in this is, there are many, but codependency is a frequent thing that we run into all the time, and we look to our friends, we look to our family, we especially look to lovers to try to cover us in this way. And see, the problem with it is that oftentimes, in order to have some of those people, like, we look for certain traits, oftentimes it's something that we idolize in another person. And that usually ends up being the root of this. We start with that which we covet. If let's say that I am a bodybuilder who has significant insecurities, I will look for people who are heavier than me because they make me feel more comfortable about myself. If their bodies are strange, I surround myself with them in order to feel good about myself. Or another example is that I might find people who are bigger and stronger than me because I want to be like them. I covet them, or I either covet what they have and seek to gain it from them, or I covet myself and try to protect myself and what I think I have by surrounding myself with people who are less than me.
Oh, it's disgusting.
What?
In the case of people in relationships, we oftentimes look at values. A lot of people with codependency issues come from broken relationships with their family, i.e., they have mommy or daddy issues. Oftentimes somebody...
You tell me.
What did he say?
I don't even know what's going on right
What did he say when he threw that thing?
now. It was a Dan.
Oh.
He just woke up and he threw it.
Oh my
Sorry.
gosh.
Yeah. So, the thing of it is that in these kinds of places where we look for kind of the fulfillment of these broken relationships, we'll see people that match them. It's been a familiar thing that we run into with different people, where they seek people that have qualities similar to their parents. For instance, somebody might seek somebody that's like their mom. They end up with a girlfriend who is awkwardly similar to their mom because they're trying to make up for that broken relationship. They're trying to seek the qualities of a mother, or they try to seek out what's comfortable for them. And see, all in all, they're trying to find something that they can control and manipulate, something that ultimately falls into line of what makes them feel okay. At the end of the day, what the problems with this are many. For one thing, it pertains to what we can control, that being the biggest thing. We seek people that we can manipulate. We seek surroundings that we can manipulate.
Mm-hmm.
And coveting in and of itself is a destructive pattern of behavior. So to address first the manipulation thing of it, or the control part of it, it's when we're trying to control our own identities. We're trying to say, this is who I am. But see, the reality is that oftentimes our perception of who we are is flawed, because so much of it is also based off of what we've gone through in life. There's no clear view of that. It's clouded by our perceptions of who we think we are based off of our experiences. If somebody's bullied, for example, they grew up thinking that they're weak. So they take on a personality of weakness. They take on a place where they're a victim and they can't stand up for themselves because every time that they've ever tried, they get beaten down. So that's a problem for them. Oftentimes this place of feeling trapped will manifest in anger issues. So they can't actually function wholly and properly in any way. They can't be strong, so they bury it. And then they're angry about that because they feel weak. This is just an example of kind of where these things will tumble at. So they try to find situations that they can control, people that are like-minded, people that are okay. There's no growth there, though.
So in generality, they try to find an even level playing field, and they just try to dominate that area they're in.
Exactly.
The comfort zone?
Yes.
Like they've already played up to the line of the comfort zone, they have to step back so they can keep
Yep.
repeating the same process.
Exactly. So, in the alternative situation where it comes down to coveting, coveting is the thing that is probably the most destructive, and that is probably the one that we run into that we can most run into with this kind of a discussion about dependency. Because see, with the things that we covet, those are the places where we're not only willing to believe false things about ourselves, but we're actually willing to diminish ourselves and our person. We're actually willing to compromise our own person and our own identity in order to try to get what we want. In the case of that bodybuilder, let's say that the people he surrounds himself with are all jacked. They're just huge, strong people. But the means by which they go about that are through steroids, performance-enhancing drugs, all these different things, and routines that are ultimately destructive. And being that person who wants to seek that out, you know all of this is dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
But you choose to go along with it because you want so much to be like them that you're willing to destroy yourself in the process of that. I don't think that I need to explain how that is destructive or how that is negative in any way, shape, or form. And especially the mentalities that you suddenly have to take on in order to justify that. I have one friend in particular, and I'm jumping a little bit, but it all pertains.
What's his name?
Her name.
Oh,
I'm not going to give you. This friend, though, every relationship that I've seen her go into, she compromises her identity and tries to build her identity in response to what she thinks her boyfriend likes. She doesn't have any strength on her own. She doesn't have any person on her own. All she has is a pale reflection of what she thinks her boyfriend will be happy with as she pursues a relationship with him. As a result of that, she doesn't know who she is. The last time that her and I got to have an actual discussion about herself was after the ending of a very long relationship. And when she was finally willing to sit down and talk about this, I asked her some questions about who she felt she was and what she needed to be okay after this. And she couldn't answer me. Because at the end of it, she did not know who she was, and she did not know what she needed in this kind of situation. Because she buried herself for so long under the identity of somebody else and tried to superimpose that onto herself. And she was horribly unhappy the entire time. Years of relationship, and she spent all of it being miserable, and she acted out in her misery by being abusive to her boyfriend.
Oh, wow.
So-
She had a right hook.
Huh?
Who are you talking about?
A friend.
She had a right hook, didn't she?
No. No. She was emotionally abusive. She would demasculate him in front of his friends, in front of his family, to him while he was alone with her. She would just run him into the ground as often as possible, which inevitably led him to being physically abusive. So it created this kind of cycle of just abuse in their relationship until finally that broke, and they had to be done. But at the end of it, she had no idea who she was, so she had to go and try to find herself again, only to find a new boyfriend who she could repeat this process with. That's atypical codependent behavior. And see, codependent behavior in that sense is not what God calls us into. See, the thing that God calls us into is that we all have an identity. We all have a something to us. And God sees that, He knows that, and oftentimes there are aspects of that that are very, very clear in our day-to-day. Say that somebody has in a very clear focus of, like, things are black and white. Their personality says that there's a right way, there's a wrong way, and that's always kind of the case. Let's say that they have a generally jovial personality. For whatever reason, they're just always happy, full of glee, ready to share that.
It's the cocaine. I'm kidding.
Or you have those people with just those natural wells of energy, you know. Some people are naturally quieter. They're more reserved. It doesn't have anything to do with their, you know, with life circumstances breaking them down. They were born as a little kid. They were content to sit quietly and play with their toys, and they grew up, and they're content to be quiet and just listen. Sometimes these are aspects of our personality that represent who we are, who we were meant to be. They're not anything that we gained. It's something that we were born with. They were qualities that were passed genetically. And a lot of these qualities are things that do come from God, like the identity that's kind of embedded into our systems here. The whole thing that when God says, you know, He knit us together in the womb, that's what He's talking about.
God used a crochet stab on me.
It was good. Anyway, so when we talk about this place of abiding in Him and being dependent on Him, that doesn't mean codependent in the sense of, you know, just destroying yourself. Now, yes, there's that part about dying to yourself, but that's a little different. There is a destruction of personality that comes with that, but oftentimes that's personality that is just made up. Take, for example, that black and white person. They suddenly, a lot of the times those kinds of people find themselves in situations where they begin to trust their own judgments above anything else. And therefore, what builds off of that is a place where they become extremely prideful, arrogant even. They have the right to judge, and they become entitled in that because they have such clear discernment on that matter. This is a good thing without that junk attached to it. It's when you apply all the rest of that and those mindsets that it becomes a dangerous thing. That's when you remove yourself from what you're meant to be, because at the end of the day, that kind of discernment and clear moral judgment is something that needs to be guided. And the only person qualified to really guide that is Jesus. Even with the more mirthful person, the very happy-go-lucky, that kind of thing, there's still that part of it. You can find yourself going into strange places with that. And who knows what you'll try to do to maintain that. I've known people who, they're like that naturally, and the moment that anything challenges that, they just kind of go into these weird places where they have to force themselves into it, rather than addressing whatever's wrong. And that's not healthy either. So, the point of this is about dependency, and about our ability to trust God with respect to our person, and with respect to understanding that there are truths about us that, yes, need to be washed away, but there are also truths about us that are fine. We were made, we were born, and there are good things about us. And those are the things that were built into us. So when we talk about this place of abiding in God, and how, even to the point where Jesus talks about, how does he phrase it? Without me, you are nothing. Or you can do nothing. There we go. I am the vine, and you are the branches. If a man remains in me and I in him, he will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not remain in me, he is like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. A statement like that, without context, can sound extremely inflammatory.
You're telling me.
Dang it. I felt it come out, and I was like, I'm surprised Shane didn't pick it up.
Nope, sorry.
Anyway, the point is, though, is that that can sound almost abusive in a sense. But the reality of what's being stated is not a statement that is demanding or commanding so much as a statement of point, or a point of truth. Even in those finer qualities of us, those good things, we do still need that place of guidance. We still need to be whole, as opposed to just half a person trying to function on our own accord. And see, we find that wholeness as we walk with God. Vine and branches is an important place to understand, because at the end of it, there is a dependency that we have to understand that we have. There's a part of there's something that we're all driven to find. There's a reason for that, because we're not made to be purely on our own here. That's not in our design. We act like it. The world teaches us to have to function on our own. But that has never been in any way what was intended with our creation. So when we see a statement like this, even in the context of it, what Jesus says, fruit apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not remain in me, he is like a branch that is thrown away and withers. If we're separate from God in this place, ultimately all we can really do is wander off and wither on our own.
And then get burned.
And then we get burned, yeah. But the point is that withering thing. We don't take into consideration what that means very often, to wither. And in the context of everything that's just been mentioned here, that's withering. That's the place where where the world effectively defines us and our qualities, where we start trying to build an identity outside of God and in the world. And ultimately, these things will cause us to suffer. No matter how we try to justify it or wrap ourselves around this, there's always that place where we will never quite be fulfilled. Mm-hmm. There are always those places where we will lack. We'll be hunting and trying so hard again and again, and we will run ourselves down again and again and again. It's the same kind of thing where we see these patterns that are repeated by so many people. I'm trying to find this job that's going to make everything all right. I'm trying to find this husband or wife, and they will make me all right. And they try, and they try, and they try, and maybe they find something that makes them kind of feel okay, but it's never quite enough. And the reality of it is that this isn't just something for like the world outside. That's just as much in the church. I have one friend in particular who I can think of off the top of my head who's very much so in this place. He keeps trying to go and find things, and he's trying to find, first it was school, then a better job, and now he's literally just going and running. And there are places where he doesn't recognize this destructive pattern that he's found himself in because it's without God. He justifies it by saying he's doing it for God, but he doesn't do it with God. And that's where what Jesus is talking about is so important, because dependency on God revolves around being with him. It isn't something you go do for him, it's something you do with him. You walk together, you talk together, you work together, you live, you function. Vine and branches. You cannot have leafy, fruity branches worth showing off and feeding from without that vine to keep them all alive. That's what gives the sustenance. That's what keeps them full and healthy. So when Jesus talks about that, the dependency that we end up looking at is not one of demand, but necessity. Without it, you'll wither. And yeah, afterwards, with those withered branches, they get tossed in the fire.
But there is still redemption due through
Absolutely.
the Lord, though. That's, well, I try to explain my grandma, and she's worried about that. She's like, I don't want to burn. I'm like, I know you don't, Grandma. She's like, your great-grandfather. But I'm like, Grandma, stop. She doesn't quite understand it, you know. Like, some people get very scared from it.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Poor lady.
So, in this place of
I'm thirsty.
of talking about this dependence, we tend to look at a lot of things like, we internalize it in a lot of ways. It becomes the kind of thing where we think about it in terms of, oh, well, that just means my spirit or my church life. We tend to, what's the term? Compartmentalize our walk with God as being something that happens at church, or something that happens within respects to a church group or a church
So,
setting.
They basically say, okay, it's time to be with God. They put on their godly hat, and then they take it off, and then they're like, I'll put my work hat, and then go. And,
Exactly.
okay.
So even in this kind of like discussion where Jesus is talking about being this thing, there are a lot of people that assume that this is only for certain circumstances. And it's not even an assumption in the sense that they just think, oh, Jesus only wants me over there. No, it's just a function of how we react. We tend to say, well, I need to be this person here, I need to be this person there.
Yeah. Like putting on many faces.
Right.
Or as some medical people say, multiple personality syndrome.
Yeah, there's that.
Schizophrenia.
Bipolar. Or
So
schizophrenia, I guess, would make more sense, yeah.
it's multiple personality disorder.
Yeah.
He's right.
Oh,
Schizophrenia
okay.
is a little different.
Okay, yeah.
We've never seen me angry.
Oh, I have.
No, I'm just kidding. We were together when I was
Yeah.
not angry.
Yeah. So, the truth of this, though, is that this doesn't end at just, church or your spirit. This comes into play with your physical well-being just as much as anything else. In Luke 12, Jesus talks about not worrying. And he talks about how God takes care of his own. He spends a lot of time discussing how, the grass, the fields, the flowers, God blessed them to look so wonderful. So why do you worry about things like clothing? It's like birds don't worry about what they'll eat, but why do you worry about what you'll eat?
Mm.
Because I'm Jewish.
Oh my
I
gosh.
have to eat kosher food.
Fair, kind of. Although you're a bad Jew, if I remember correctly. Something about a bacon cheeseburger in front of the rabbi.
I was 3 and my dad gave it to me. It's his fault.
Yeah. Well, at the same time, Jesus is also the one who broke who effectively did away with the food laws and the kosher
Mhm.
thing. So, to be fair, you're fine. I mean, really. But there is this place where there's so much that we don't need to worry about, in the sense that we just thirst and hunger after the things that will protect us. Part of this dependency thing is knowing that we'll be protected, knowing that God has our back, and trusting in that. Which means, in the last 3 messages that have been about trust, you can't have this place of being content, walking with God and trusting in Him without that key T word there. It makes it impossible to do this, to even function alongside of him, because at the same, where we want to sit back and be like, well, I'm going to abide in you today, Jesus, we can't, because then we get into that place of like, well, I can't, I have to go do this thing in order to get the food. I have to go do this thing in order to get this. I have to go do this thing. And it becomes this kind of game of, well,
I was
really
going to, but this popped up.
Right.
It's like instead of telling your friend you don't want to go to the party, you're like, I would, but I got this thing.
Right. It just all becomes a distraction.
And we've all done it once, don't we? I'm not the only person.
Yeah.
No, you're not the only person.
So,
I'm perfect, actually, so I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
So about lying,
the lying down or the lying to
The Lion King.
yeah.
Oh my God.
So
He was afraid of this moment.
considering that she came in singing songs,
He was afraid of the entire thing.
yeah, it's only a matter of time before something
Beat me with
triggers
the
her.
cross. You're not the only one that gets whipped across the back. Oh dear.
I'm so lost right now.
Anyway,
Let's go back to the Bible.
let's go back to the Bible
Jesus.
The BIBLE.
and talk about Jesus, because that has nothing to do with Jews getting whipped.
I was thinking about
Oh my gosh.
Anyway, so the point is that it comes to this place where
Oh man.
we end up making it about what we need, and that becomes a justification to look away. And I know that's kind of an odd message, and I know that's something that might not completely compute, but to explain it this way, there's a place of going and getting what we need, and there's a place of worrying about what we need, where our mental stock and our function is based around the things that we are trying to get for ourselves. The things that we think we need, the things that we really, really want, even though we justify it on these other grounds. And in our perception, sometimes we just look at it as some things that we truly need in order to be happy, or in order to keep living. And sometimes that's just not true. There are a lot of places where we can compromise ourselves and our relationship with God in order to get these things. And in doing so, that will separate us out from God. When the reality is that for those who do trust in Him, and have trusted in Him, and honestly, there are plenty in this room even who have had times where they didn't trust in God, and He still came through and provided for them, despite the fact that they were wrapped up in their own world.
Mhm.
They were thinking, oh crap, I'm going to starve, and then lo and behold, there's food.
And
Or
then
money
we think
for
it's
food.
not good. It's like, oh, probably somebody read my Facebook post.
Right. So there are always these kinds of circumstances. So the point is that as far as God's children are concerned, He'll provide a way for us. And there is a place where we can trust Him even with the physical things, even with the needs and the wants and the desires. And the truth is that there are a lot of wants and desires that are just fine. One of the most misquoted scriptures in all the Bible.
Just judge not.
No.
That's one of them.
Thou shalt not be so nosy.
Where is it?
You just wept.
Then you can sniff their thoughts.
Oh my God, it's happened. I need some duct tape. I'm just gonna stick it over my mouth next time. Oh,
What did you say?
You just realized that?
Oh. and then tape your hands like this so you can't take the tape off if you want to speak. So you just
Shane, that's called holding hostage of
There it
somebody.
Kidnapping.
Okay.
Yeah, you guys kidnapped me.
One of the most often misquoted scriptures in all the Bible is If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be given you.
Yeah.
I want to be skinny.
And see, the point is that what people miss is that part about if you remain in me and my words remain in you.
It's kind of like the knock and it will be given. Knock and he will answer.
See, I've heard,
Ask and it will be given. And like some people think like, oh, this just means you can basically ask for anything that you want. But they don't realize that if it's not God's will, then it won't happen.
see, my brother used that trick on me. He's like, hey, Ellis, I need $200. For what? I need to go. I'm going to Spain with my soccer team. Can you give me $200? No? He's like, but the Bible says, ask and you shall receive, seek and you shall
Wow.
find. And I was like,
I feel like he
well,
was
you asked the
purposely,
wrong
like-
person, and you should seek a job to give you that money.
That's,
He's old enough to get a job. And I'm like, get a job. He's
I
like,
feel
I
like
can't.
he was partially like joking when he
No,
was
he
saying-
was serious. My mom's like, why won't you give him the money? I'm like, because he's old enough to get a job. Like, I got a job around that age. Why shouldn't he? And she's like, because he has to worry about his future. I'm like,
And you don't.
I think you need to knock on somebody
Wait, he's
else's
the
door.
Romanian child, right? And you're the
Yeah.
Black Indian.
Oh my gosh.
anyway, I'm supposed to be about this. I just don't understand. Anyway, though, but this is one of those things that is so often misquoted and misidentified. And it's something that we run into all the time because we hear entire forms of Christianity built around this idea. And see, the reality is that you can ask for God for whatever you want, seriously.
Mhm.
You just probably won't get it. And I don't say that in the sense of, you know, everything that you ask for is evil or wrong or anything like that. It's just that there are a lot of things that are within his timing and within his way. Because at the end of it, when our lives are given over to him and when we are walking with him, it's a team thing. It stops being about just you and what you want. It starts being about what the two of you can build. And this is not something that people really consider because a lot of us, the way that we approach this kind of message, and in particular, honestly, the way that most of us approach Christianity is a very self-focused thing. It's not about God, it's about you. It's about what we want, and it's about us finding a point where we can be happy in our faith and be safe from hell at the same time.
Or basically, like, you know, I want the benefits, but I want work as minimum as possible, you know, getting that great job. And
Right. God's just a means to an end for a lot of us. And it kind of sucks to say that, but it is the truth for most situations. I know that I've had to look at myself and catch myself being there in the past. So this is like a real life thing. But the point is that with God, he's not calling us into that. He didn't send Jesus to die for that. He's all about that partnership thing. So at the end of the day, he's looking for what we can build together
teamwork
with him,
makes
with
the
us. Yes.
Okay.
And that's the point, is that those requests, there's a really interesting thing that happens with those prayer requests when you start walking with him, when your life changes in such a way, when you actually do walk in a way that is dependent on him and with him. Those desires change. What you originally thought was always going to be a part of you, it tends to fade away. And you start finding yourself valuing things that are very, very different from what you had in the past. It's really hard to see that, especially at the outset of a walk with God, or even for many Christians who've been there for years. It can be really difficult to see this because we get so caught up in certain ideas and ways for things to work. But we don't understand that point that, yeah. So, at the end of it, he ends up wanting us and wanting us with him.
Kind of sounds like, not trying to interrupt, but it kind of sounds like a marriage, you know, like you think of all these things and all this and that, what you want to do with your spouse, and then, you know, as time goes on, the more you rely on them, the more it's like, you know, that didn't matter, you know, it doesn't matter what kind of house we have, as long as we got a roof, you know.
Right. That's a lot of it. There's a reason why Christianity and why relationship with God is often discoursed about as being a marriage, why it's referenced like that. So, kind of one of the last things to go over, I believe, pertaining to that, just as like a message per se, pertaining to this discussion about dependency. And see, as we are dependent on God and as we change and develop, we take on more of His character. And more than that, we take on more of our own character. And effectively, we are refined in those places. So going back to that example of the person with the super black and white discernment, in the best possible circumstance, functioning alongside God, that person is able to see where God is working and where He's not. Where something is from God and where it's not. Where a person's making things up and where they're really following Him. And see, the thing of it is having that ability, they're able to help those people move forward in their lives in this kind of way. They're able to help elevate other people, to help encourage other people, and also at times to help break down the strongholds that many people would claim are going to be there forever, or are going to hide behind or justify. It's really easy to see that stuff with, such a clarity of vision. And this is something that will oftentimes be used by God. A lot of prophets have this kind of clarity of vision. A lot of them have that very black and white kind of moral mindset. It's frequent with them. And they end up being some of the most important people and influential people within the body of Christ. When we get into talks about, the parts of the body and the relationships of, the individuals in the church, the role of a prophet is extremely important to the function of a church body, because these people are able to see so clearly and they're able to help so much. But that's only when they're with God. Otherwise it becomes destructive. Because something that's so clear needs to be reined in a little bit. Otherwise it can become self-serving really quickly. But in that place, this person is walking with God, and that discernment is so clear. The last thing to go over is kind of the realities of what happens in this place of dependency. See, it's not enough to say that, we're supposed to be dependent on Jesus, we need Him, but there's also the reality of what it looks like to walk with Him when we've reached that point, when we've realized what that is, what that means. Because that's not always easy. And see, the thing of it is, there are a lot of places where there is that struggle with ourselves, specifically in those places where, even just waiting for Him to provide for us, because there is a timing for Him. And He'll work things out, but sometimes it takes longer than we want, assuming that it's something He's going to do.
Yeah.
But the other side of it comes down to what Jesus talks about the persecution of Christians and what people would face, because that is a real thing. And using that example of that person with the kind of prophetic mindset there, when you're going up and you're seeing things about people, about where they're really at versus where they're trying to tell themselves they're at, they really don't appreciate that. Like, if you walk in and effectively go Godzilla on their delusions, they tend not to appreciate it. They tend to get very defensive. Some of them run away. Some of them will just straight up fight you. And then they'll run away and they'll tell other people that you're a terrible person for this and this reason, and go on a list and a tear.
All because you ruined their dreams.
All because
You mean their delusions.
Right. Yeah. And that's the thing of it, is that there are plenty of times where that's what God actually calls us into, to be that person and to do that thing. and especially like a prophet as an example, that is something that God will call you to do, because that's actually part of your job description, so to speak, within the church body. It's the way that you use that kind of straightforward and very clear mindset in order to help people, because the truth is if people are maintaining those delusions, they're not able to receive help. We go back to those patterns, those destructive patterns, and you know that point where they have to like stop in order to maintain it,
Yeah.
or they have to conform to and justify themselves in order to. I don't know why I keep having such a hard time using the word compromise. They have to compromise themselves in order to maintain those things. They want to stay there. That's comfortable, or that's safe, or they're getting what they want. And having clarity of vision means that you can see where that's destructive. So you end up becoming something that challenges what they want. Jesus got killed because he challenged what people wanted.
They wanted to conquer, right?
They wanted a conqueror, but more than that, the Pharisees wanted something else. The Pharisees wanted to maintain their power and their government, as it were. So at the end of the day, Jesus ended up being brought to death because he challenged so many of their traditions. They didn't like that.
None of us did. I mean, none of them did.
Right.
None did.
So there are places where we're comfortable and where we feel okay, safe, and even where we feel okay, where Jesus is going to challenge us. And as such, there are places where we're going to have to challenge each other in order to get out of those places. And people will hate that. And people will hate us for that. And that's okay.
But there are certain things we can't challenge, are there? Like, I find it hard for me because sometimes I know the Bible says respect thy mother and father, but some of their ideas is not gonna happen. Like, some of the stuff they said for my siblings is very, I think, delusional, because they're expecting them to perform a certain way. And I'm not trying to be mean, but one of the things is my father wants us to have good paying jobs. Well, I told him I wanted to go to school for ministry. He lost his mind and he got really upset and told me, you know what, call me when you think of an actual job. And that seemed delusional to me because he raised me. Like, when I was Jewish, he said, you're going to serve in the temple, you're going to do what the Lord says, and this and this. And now that we're Christian, like, I hope he loves the Lord. But, like, he's starting to tell us, like, don't work in a church, you know? Like, it's just a job that won't pay. I'm like, there's more to that than just, you know, getting paid. Like, the Lord, you know, you're kind of saying stuff about his house. Like, I wouldn't, like, sometimes I make inappropriate things and stuff, but to say that that's not a good job to do and you shouldn't go into it, that's kind of overstepping for me. It's like, you know, you should really, you know, just, I'll work in the Lord's house all day. I mean, I'm fine with it, but kind of saying, like, the Lord doesn't do anything for you if you work in his house, it's like, yeah, I wouldn't push that envelope, you know. Like,
Literally just read a whole thing about that, so.
Yeah.
But there's a big difference. One of the things to remember with that is, like, respecting your mother and father. It doesn't mean you always have to agree with them or anything like that. There are places where how we show respect, that's one thing. And respecting their person, their character, more so respecting just and honoring them for who they were or who they have been, in the sense of what they provided for you,
well,
even if that was good or bad.
yeah. I respect them, it's just, my siblings, just, I don't know how to help, like, And every time I try to say something, it's like, or when my parents ask me something and they feel it's different from their view, they're like, get out of our house. It's kind of at that point.
Yeah.
Right, Shane? You don't even know.
Well, I don't know, like, what you've been through in your family, but you've told me a lot of stories about what has happened, but I can imagine how you feel. For sure.
Tired.
Yeah. And again, like, there are just places of where it's okay to disagree, where it's okay to be at odds even, but there is a place to show respect, and it's kind of navigating that and where that is. So,
That's why I find hard for me is, like, I know the Bible says respect my father especially, but at the same time, it's the way he thinks. It's like, yeah, I can't agree with you on this because the father's the head of the house in my culture, but at the same time, like, you can't always listen to him because you know that's not the way you should think, but still you're supposed to say you're right even though they're wrong, and it's like, no, that's not that's not how I take it, you know. I don't know. Lord will answer me when the time comes.
yeah.
Just gonna be a good little Jewish boy and count my money. I mean, read the word.
Oh my gosh.
Multitasking, you turn the page, count. Come on. Like,
Use the money as bookmarks.
so, the other aspect of that is, so there is the persecution side of this and the way that there is challenge. And understand when we talk about like challenging those kinds of things and the way that we challenge the world, that doesn't always mean in the sense of addressing what's broken in people, in the sense of it, you know, this person is prideful, this person is whatever. That person that is happy-go-lucky can be just as much of a challenge to the world as anybody else. Somebody that's overly generous can be just as much of a challenge to the world and can be hated just as much. You ever see the way that, like, when you run into people, or when there are people that show up who really are just genuinely happy, there are some people that will try to tear them down. They'll work their best to try to, like, bring their mood down, to hurt them, because they're miserable. And they can't handle somebody like that. There are plenty of these people in the world just as well. And this can be just as much of a challenge, because at the end of the day, what we end up representing as we grow in our dependence on God and as we partner with Him more and more.
How could you do that while he's preaching?
We didn't realize
I'm
you
sorry,
did that.
brother.
I'm staring
Can't
right
tell
at
what
you.
do?
Anyway.
What did you do?
But it's just, anyway.
Wow.
I love how he pointed to me.
So, the thing of it is that that person can be just as much of a challenge, and this can be just as important for people, because the truth is that at the end of the day, what a lot of these things being challenged are perceptions. They're the way that people have grown to see the world. They're those people that are withered, as it were. They're embittered, they're frustrated, they've built walls around themselves, lies, they're deluded. Whatever it is, at the end of the day, there are things about God that are not true in the world. And we, as we partner with Him, become representations more and more of Him, and of His character, of His person, of Jesus Christ, whom the Spirit of is within us. And in and of itself, as we carry that name and that identity, and that grows and builds more and more, people start to see that more and more, and that becomes a challenge to them more and more in so many different ways. And therein lies this place where we are actually able to go out and change the world in our own little circles, in our own little ways. It just depends, at the end, it just depends on how God is functioning with you and how you're built, the kind of person you are, or the kind of person that you really are, as opposed to whatever you've told yourself, or the little piece that you found out and then built something weird off of.
Yeah, sure.
So, the last thing, which we'll end up picking up on and discussing more next week, and this is just kind of like a little snippet, is part of depending on Him is learning what it is to love and how to love the people around you, how to love God, how to love people, how to minister, that kind of thing. And we'll start going over that more and more, probably over the course of the next few weeks. I don't know how long we'll be talking about love, but I do know that it starts next week. And it starts with this chapter and the verses where Jesus talks about loving people and His commands to His followers.
His swallowers?
That's what I heard.
I totally
Oh.
heard swallowers.
I did too.
I wanted to say something, but I was like,
I
no.
did. That was the one time I was going to keep a straight face too.
Yeah.
Thank God it's not only me.
Yeah.
We are all imperfect,
Yeah.
but the Lord makes us semi-perfect.
Anyway. So, with that, there is that part of it of just learning to love from God's point of view and learning what that looks like, how that is. And in truth, that can even be just learning how to love in general, because some people don't. There are plenty of people that are just kind of full of hate.
Me, right?
Right. He pointed. Anyway.
People who work in retail.
For African.
Oh.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So, there are places where those things change about us as we grow more dependent on Jesus, as we see Him more and learn more from Him.
They learn how to love Shane.
I know.
So,
Saw those times he didn't feed me.
anyway, we'll continue on with that like next week. For now, though, we're done.
Are you mad? Oh, we're done with the thing. Like, I
Yeah,
thought
we're
you
done.
meant like we're done, like as in like I'm done with this. I was like, oh no.
I was like, how could
That's-
you give up that